what you're going to hear right now is going to be very different than what you've been hearing the rest of the day. I'm not a herbalist, and I'm not in the health field at all. I usually do a lot of interacting with atheists and secular people. So a lot of what I say on this doesn't really apply to you. I'm assuming if you're in this, in this guild and at this conference, you are a Christian and believe in the soul or a immaterial side of us, where I'm coming from a worldview and interacting with a lot of people from worldviews that believe that we're just physical things. So this is meant to be helpful to you in a way of if you're interacting with a atheist or someone who holds that we're just simply physical things. This is something that I've covered with me and Voss's students before. So just to start off, I just like to start with a quick thought experiment. So I want everybody here to picture a basketball in your head. Okay, so now where is that basketball, right? And I think we all know if we were to get a saw and saw open your head and saw open your brain, we're not going to find a physical basketball in there. This image of a basketball in your head is in a sense immaterial, right? And so I think there's a simple thought experiment to show that we interact with the immaterial as a regular part of our experience. Nobody believes that basketball is a physical thing. So we're going to get into a little of what atheists, how they maybe explain away our minds or our souls. And again, this is just to help all of us just think out these things both biblically and philosophically. So whether humans have an immaterial component, now depending on who you're reading and if they're more theology or philosophy, they might refer to it as the mind, consciousness, the soul, and we're going to get a little into that. But whether we have that immaterial component to us has a lot of implications. So here's just like a quick brainstorm that I thought of different implications, but it definitely affects our anthropology and our idea of what personhood is, right? So what is a human? Are humans just complex flesh robots? And what makes a person? And that in turn, how we answer those questions in turn affect our ideas about human rights, right? And morality. This also affects how we think about artificial intelligence, because again, if humans are just complicated flesh, robots or machines, then yes, a computer might be able one day to become self-aware or conscious. And then would that make a computer a person if they get this self-awareness or consciousness? So again, all these questions kind of are intermingled. It affects worldview, because if we do have a soul, we have to reject certain worldviews. So we would have to reject strictly physical views of the world, whether they're atheists or others. And worldview is very important because how we answer certain key components, and we'll talk a little more about this later, but certain key questions about reality, like where do we come from, where are we going, that really affects our values, and that in turn affects our behavior. Another question that comes up is whether we have a soul or not, really comes into the free will debate. Do humans have free will? So again, we'll talk a little about that. Are we just flesh computers pre-programmed by our biology? Are we responsible for our actions, or are they just the result of a long line of physical forces and reactions? And then finally, obviously, all of you here would agree with this. It really has something to do with our health, because if we just believe humans are physical things, how we approach medicine and health is going to be very different. And as I'm already hearing from Voss's introduction and through the other speakers, is obviously we as Christians believe we have to have a holistic approach to the human, which means body, mind, and spirit. So obviously this question of whether we have an immaterial side to us or not has a lot of impact on how we live and how we see life. So speaking biblically, I'm going to give you a little biblical overview, but the view that the Bible holds and we should hold as Christians is what's usually called dualism, which is essentially that we have both a physical and an immaterial side to us. And we see this in Matthew 10:28, when Jesus says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." So clearly, we see Jesus speaking of the dualism of us as humans. We have both body and soul. Now, so again, dualism, we have a body, which is me, right? It's I, it's Steve. But then there's also the immaterial me, the other me. And these two things together holistically make me. So then the question is, what is the immaterial me? Is it a soul, a spirit, a mind? Are these all the same things? Are they different components to our immaterial side? And there's no quick, easy answer to that, just to be open. So we'll unpack that a bit. And when we open our Bibles and really look, we see the word soul used in different ways. So sometimes it could be mean the whole person, like he's a wise old soul, right? But we also see times where it's used distinctly from the body and the spirit. But then other times we also see it's used very interchangeably with the word spirit. So the quick answer is just like in English, how we kind of use spirit and soul in different ways. So for example, I could say I had a argument and it was full of spirit. That means something very different than as I was serving the poor, I was filled with the spirit, right? Very different meaning versus saying a music is full of soul, right? So even in English, we use those words differently, and we have to look at the context. And we see this in the Bible with soul and spirit as well. They're used in a variety of different ways. So when we look at the Hebrew, it's got various usages, which includes essential core of the person, as well as the center and transmitter of feelings and perceptions. When we look at spirit in Hebrew, we see various usage as well. We see it's the principle of life in humans and animals. We see it could be the seat of emotions. It could refer to the mind, it could refer to the will, it could refer to wind or breath, and its usage often overlaps with soul. When we look at the New Testament in the Greek, we find very similar things. The soul is the life-giving aspect, the animating aspect of living things. It's the seat and center of the inner human life in its many and varied aspects. It's an entity with personhood. And then spirit, again, various usages include the life-giving animated aspect of living things, the source and seat of insight, feeling and will, a spiritual state of mind, disposition, wind or breath. And then again, it overlaps with the use of soul in Greek as well. So again, it really comes down to context and making sure we read it in context so we understand it better. So just to give an example, let's look at Matthew 22, 36 through 37, where Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And I've, sat down and tried to figure out, okay, is each one of those things something different? Or because honestly, the easy way, if I'm just giving a sermon or summing this up, the quick thing I could say is, well, Jesus is telling us to love God with our whole being, right? That's what he's saying, right? That's the gist of it. We are to love God with every part of ourselves, with our whole beings. But when we look at the nuances of each of the words, the heart has, again, very varied usages, just like soul and spirit. It could be the center and source of physical life, the center and source of the whole inner life, the seat of physical, spiritual, and mental life. The soul seems to be here, I think, the seat and center of the inner human life in its many and varied aspects. And then the mind, is the faculty of thinking, comprehending, and reasoning, understanding, intelligence. So when I take into account what soul and mind most likely mean here, it seems to me that heart, maybe Jesus is mentioning a heart as something separate as the center and source of physical life. So essentially, God is Jesus, who is God, is telling us to love God with our physical selves, as well as our thinking selves, as well as our whole inner being, our whole immaterial self. So it's interesting to look at some of these passages where they use heart, mind, soul, spirit, and really getting into the context of it and what we believe Scripture is telling us. Now we're going to come back to J.P. Moreland, but J.P. Moreland is a Christian philosopher. Voss and I both think very highly of him. He's a solid guy, solid Bible-believing Christian, very godly man from everything I know about him, but also a great Christian thinker who's still living. And this is how he breaks it down. And we're going to get a little more into J.P. Moreland later, but he's what's called a substance dualist. We don't have to get into what the substance part means. I have it in my notes, so if people have questions about it later. But some of this stuff gets very philosophical, and I'll be honest, some of it gets a little over my head. But he breaks it down this way: the soul includes the mind and the spirit. So that's your whole immaterial self. And then the body, which includes the brain. And he breaks down the mind and spirit this way: the mind is a faculty of the soul that contains thoughts and beliefs, abilities to reason. And the spirit is a faculty of the soul through which a person relates to God. And there's some passages there you can look up later if you'd like. And apart from God, the capacities of the spirit are dead and inoperative. And again, that makes sense in the Christian worldview because we believe we're dead in our sins until we are awakened through the power of the Holy Spirit. So we are spiritually dead even when we're physically alive until our spirits are reconnected with God through the Holy Spirit. So this is how he breaks it down. And the soul to him is basically the substantial unified reality that informs the body. Okay, so he believes the soul and body are two distinct things yet united. So again, we'll get into that a little more later. So I'm just going to plow through the presentation and then we'll do questions. And if anybody, just let me say it now, if anybody wants a copy of this PowerPoint, I have absolutely no problem sharing it with you. So I will send a copy, a PDF of it to Voss, and he can share it with all of you or as he chooses. Okay. Because I know I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, and I'm the type of person who likes to write down notes because I forget everything as soon as the presentation's over. And I want you to be able to relax and absorb what I'm saying without panicking to try to write down notes. So I'll be glad to share the presentation with everybody. But we're going to, right now, like I said, we're going to compare physicalism, which is essentially an atheist view that we're nothing but physical, to dualism, the idea that we are both physical and spiritual. And this all comes down to worldview, what our view of the world is. And we don't have time to unpack all that. But really, when you're approaching any worldview, there's three very good questions to ask. And for you just to keep in mind as we unpack this stuff, and maybe at the end, we can talk about it more. But essentially, no matter what the worldview is, whether it's Christian worldview, atheistic worldview, or some spiritual worldview like Hinduism or Buddhism, you have to ask these questions. Is it internally coherent? Meaning, does it make logical sense within the system? Is there anything within the system that contradicts itself or just doesn't make logical sense when you put all kind of the puzzle pieces together? And that, again, that's the eternal coherence of the worldview or the personal philosophy. Second question, does it have explanatory power? Meaning, does it make sense of reality? Does it seem to match up with what we know about reality? And then the third one, a big one to test that, is asking yourself, can this be lived? if it seems like there's a certain belief in a worldview and it just doesn't seem livable, that's a pretty good indication that maybe there's something wrong. So we're going to come back to those too, but just keep those in mind as we unpack some of these views. So we're going to look at three major views. So again, these are some fancy words, which again come from the philosophy world, and I'm not a philosopher, but the one is called reductive physicalism. And essentially it just means this: the brain is the mind. There's no difference between the two. We're just physical things. So your brain is your mind and your mind is your brain. There's no difference between the two. The next one is non-reductive physicalism, which again gets very complicated and is a bit over my head. But really the main thing we have to focus on is it's this emergent view of consciousness, which essentially says the brain generates the mind. The brain made the mind. And again, we'll get a little deeper into that. And then finally, we have substance dualism, or we'll just call it dualism, where the mind is independent from the brain, but they interact. So we're going to unpack those three things. And as a Christian, you can guess that I'm a dualist. So obviously, I'm going to lean towards that. So first, I have an example of different people who hold these worldviews. So Sam Harris, he's a neurologist, a philosopher, very outspoken atheist, podcast host, author, one of the quote unquote new atheists that emerged in the early 2000s. So not so new anymore. But he is a reductive physicalist. He believes the brain is the mind. So essentially, I, like the me that makes me me, and the you that makes you you, right? The I that makes Steve Steve, is really just a brain and central nervous system, the result of physics and chemistry. And brain science can access and explain consciousness. Now, it's no, and again, we'll unpack this in a minute, but it's no coincidence that therefore Sam Harris is a hard determinist, which essentially means everything is determined because we're just physical chemical reactions. So therefore, there's no free will. And many atheists hold that view, including Steve Hawking held that view. So let's unpack this a little. So one of the big issues with this is correlation is not the same as being the same, right? So we have overwhelming evidence of the causal interaction between mind and body. And I heard several examples of that already. So you probably don't need more, but we all know if you're under mental stress, you start having stomach problems and digestive problems. We also know when you're physical fatigued, you get grumpy. You have the inability to concentrate. So we have overwhelming evidence that the mind affects the body and the body affects the mind. So just because A and B are correlated does not mean they are identical. And that's, pretty common sense. So like I said, some of this stuff gets a little over my head, but really when you get down to it, some of it is fairly commonsensical. So a lot of times what atheists that hold this view will do is they'll point to brain scans and say, okay, well, look, you can see parts of the brain lighting up when they're thinking about certain things or doing certain things. So yes, we can observe brain activity, but it's not the same as what's going on in your mind because we cannot observe thoughts, right? We can electrically stimulate the brain to move limbs and mouth. We can even experience memories and smells by electrically stimulating the brain, but you cannot make it create thoughts, decisions, or beliefs. So again, correlation doesn't mean it's the same exact thing. It just means that they interact. And when we see the brain activity in these brain scans, it's just showing that interaction, but it does not mean that the brain is therefore the same exact thing as the mind. And again, we're going to unpack that more as we go along. And these are just quotes from two very smart people, a lot smarter than me. Consciousness seems to be wholly impervious to science. So the problem, it's called the problem of consciousness for atheists because it is a problem. They really can't explain consciousness. And essentially, when you get to talking about consciousness, you're out of the realm of science. You can really, science ends, because now we're talking about immaterial, an immaterial thing. And I like this quote by Raymond Tallis, who himself is an atheist and a neuroscientist. He said, the experiments that are used to support the conclusion that this bit of the brain houses that bit of us are mind-numbingly simplistic. And he has a whole book where he just kind of rips that apart. And again, a lot of it gets very scientific and above my head. I'll be honest, I didn't finish the whole thing because it just got too specified, but I was able to follow some of the arguments, and that's where this quote comes from. He also said this, and this is where we get to the whole free will debate, because again, if we are just physical things, we really don't have free will at all. And again, even though he is an atheist who does not hold to the body having a soul, he's still very much opposed to this idea of us simply being this very simplified idea of humans just being physical things. He says, if physicalism is true, we may have to jettison the notion of freedom and consequently of personal responsibility. Worse still, to be identified with our brains is to be identified with a piece of matter, and this, like all other pieces of matter, is subject to and cannot escape from the laws of material nature. Everything that happens to our brains is the product of material events that impinge on them and the events that result from brain activity. Notably, our actions are wired into the endless causal net extending from the Big Bang to the Big Crunch. That is the history of the material universe. Our destiny, like that of pebbles and waterfalls, is to be predestined. So even though he resists this idea as an atheist, he sees that that is the logical conclusion if all we are physical objects. So we have these two very different views of the world. We have determinism, where we have no free will. Essentially, our actions, or what we are, is nature, which would be like our genes, our DNA, versus nurture, which would be our upbringing, our environment, and brain activity. And this essentially leads to our actions and what we do. We're really not making any decisions. We're just a stream of states, events in a causal chain, and the whole idea of us making decisions of any sort is really an illusion. On the other hand, we have libertarianism, which is the view that we do have free will. We have the freedom to choose. And like some people to put it, we have free will and free won't, meaning we have the freedom to choose otherwise. We can bypass nature and nurture and brain activity. Now, they definitely can affect our behavior and our decisions and things like that, but we also have the ability to bypass those. And we generally have the ability to act differently when we choose. So, so we see some big problems with the physicalist view and the determinist view, where essentially it would destroy moral obligation and accountability. And let me ask you this, going back to the worldview questions, is that livable? Can we really live in such a way where we can't hold anybody accountable for their actions, and because we're just essentially it's out of our control? It seems to me that libertarianism is the more self-evident truth that reflects reality. All right, now moving on. So now we got our second view now. We have the non-reductive physicalism, but like I said, the emergent consciousness idea, which is the brain generates the mind. And this is Daniel Dennett, a very well-known philosopher, another one of the new atheists. He just recently died, I think just maybe 2 or 3 months ago, passed away. And he holds a view that the brain reaches a level of complexity to produce mental states, sort of like a fire creates smoke. And he's very clear that consciousness, that is I or you, is an illusion. It's a trick of the brain. Now, even, again, fellow atheists criticize this view, and they point out two big problems with it. One is the first thing we talked about, which is that there's a clear correlative back and forth between the mind and the brain, right? The body and the mind. They clearly influence each other, and there's a clear interaction between the two. It's not simply just the brain, um, you know, producing the mind and it being a one-way street in a sense. The other issue, which is a very common sense sort of issue, is if I am just an illusion, this idea of Steve, D. Sebastian, is just an illusion, then what is having the illusion? Right? If I don't exist, then I can't have an illusion. So it's kind of a self-defeating sort of idea to say that our consciousness is just an illusion, because don't you need consciousness in order to have an illusion? So some big roadblocks with that view. Along with that, we have the problem, the physical immaterial divide. Physical cause always leads to physical effect. So there's a big question physicalists have in answering: how can something physical create or cause something immaterial? And like I said, people will honestly say, well, really, when we get to consciousness, talking about the mind or the soul, we're out of the realm of science. We can no longer do physical and natural science. We are in the realm of philosophy and theology at that point. So give you one more example. Is what's called the hard problem of consciousness, and snickerdoodles. Now, my daughter is 8 years old. Last week, she asked me if we could, she got a baking book from the library and asked me if we could make snickerdoodles. Now, I'm not even sure what a snickerdoodle is. When she asked me that, I was like, I don't know. Let me see the book. But they're pretty tasty and they smell really good when they're baking. They're I guess they're almost like cinnamon, like brownies, I guess one way you could. But here's a thought experiment. um Say you never smelled snickerdoodles, and but right now I gave you a scientific explanation of the smell of snickerdoodles. So I give you comprehensive knowledge, like you understand the science of the way the chemicals from the baking process interact with your brain synapses, right? So you understand it forward and backwards scientifically of what that chemical process is and how it goes into your nose and interacts with your brain. Even knowing all that, would you still know what snickerdoodles smell like? And the answer is clearly no, right? Um, Knowing the science, knowing the physical science is not the same as actually experiencing that. And this is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. They can't make that jump from something physical to something immaterial. And this is just a quote from a writer. He says that we are conscious beings is one of the most obvious things we can ever know, yet it is an aspect of our existence that resolutely, I can't say it, refuses to fit into the box of atheist materialism. So now we come to our buddy J.P. Moreland. So he is a substance dualist. Again, we don't have to get into the different types of dualism, but he believes the mind is independent from the brain. That humans are both body and soul. Okay, the brain and soul interact. They're different entities with different properties, yet they interact. And the soul can survive apart from the body. So usually the view, like an analogy, is often a car with a driver. So we have someone who can drive perfectly well, but maybe the car has a flat tire, maybe it's got a bad engine, maybe there's something wrong with its rotors. So the car isn't driving well, even though there's nothing wrong with the driver. Um, so in this analogy, the driver would be the mind, and the body would be the car. Now we want to be careful because we don't want to fall into Gnosticism. So this was an early church heresy, very much influenced by Greek philosophy and Plato. And honestly, even Christian greats like Augustine was very influenced by Plato. But this is the Gnostics held the view that anything physical was evil or bad, and only the spiritual was true and good. So they went to such extremes that they would say that Jesus wasn't even really bodily, wasn't a bodily incarnation, that he only appeared to be, uh, man, and that he never rose physically. Because again, in their worldview, anything physical was bad. And the Gnostics would take two very extreme views of living that out. Some would punish the body, whip themselves, do extreme fasting and things like that, because the body was evil and needed to be tamed in a sense. Or you had the exact opposite. The body was inconsequential, so they could do whatever they want with it. They could live very immoral lives. They could sleep around with who they wanted, eat whatever they wanted, because the body was inconsequential. So we want to avoid a view that the mind, even though in a sense the mind is the driver of the body, but we know that God created both the body and mind and created them good. And we as humans are holistically brain and soul. And again, even if we were going to get deeper into theology, even we could even say upon death, when the soul is separated from the body, this is really an unnatural state that God didn't intend. This is a result of the fall. And then again, theology teaches us, Jesus taught that at the end times we would be resurrected into our bodies again, would be made whole again. So again, we just want to avoid this mistake. I grew up with a very shallow understanding of Christianity, which I just thought it was, you die and you go to heaven, and then you just float around in clouds as an angel, and that's it. So when I became a Christian, I really started studying the Bible and realized, oh no, we're going to be resurrected and reunited with our bodies. That was new information to me. So yeah, that was a bit of a rant, but I just want to make sure we avoid that mistake. Okay. So we're getting towards the end of the presentation. So what I'm going to do now is use one of J.P. Moreland's arguments to show that our immaterial self is very different than the physical world. And essentially, he's using this law of the indiscernibility of identicals, which sometimes philosophy is just very common sense, and this seems very common sense, right? But essentially, this is the idea. If two things are truly identical, they're really one thing, not two. Any truth about the one will apply to the other. Thus, if we can find just one truth for A that's not true for B or vice versa, then they are not identical. So pretty common sense, right? But essentially, let's say we take Batman and we compare Batman to Voss, right? So now, both of them dress up like bats and go out and fight crime at night, but Batman doesn't have a manly beard. So clearly Batman and Voss are not the same people. Easy enough? But if we compared Batman to Bruce Wayne, we'd eventually realize they are the same exact people. Okay, so easy enough, right? Pretty common sense. So I'm going to go through these pretty quick. But like say, if you notice, it says if you can find just one truth that's not true for the other, they are not identical things. So we're going to compare the mind to the brain or to physical things. Are humans more than just physical things? And we're going to see several ways they're not the same. So we're not just finding one, we're finding several. And like I said, I'll go through it quick and I'll be glad to share this presentation with everybody, and then we can, answer any questions the best I can when we're done. All right, so first we have awareness of self. So we talk about ourselves in the first person. If we're physical objects, then third person physical descriptions will capture all the facts about us. So again, I've known Voss for about 10 years now. We're pretty good friends. I could tell you a lot about Voss. And even if I had comprehensive knowledge about Voss, I still can't tell you what he's thinking right now, right at this very moment. So first person eyes are very different than third person physical descriptions, right? I can take this water bottle on my desk and tell you everything physically about it, but I can't do that for Voss or for any of you, or for well, I guess for myself, I can tell you what I'm thinking. But if we were just physical objects, we could observe and basically capture everything there is to know about us. We have indivisibility, which means I am fully present throughout my physical body. Um, my physical body is made of separate parts, but I am fully present throughout them. Now, you see the severed arm right there. So an illustration that's often used is if you lose a part of your body part, um, it's not like we lose some of you. So a very really example of this is, which was a very unfortunate thing, is one of the students, Voss and I have at Rutgers, lost the tip of one of his fingers using a log splitter. His name was Gus. His name is Gus. And when he came to our next meeting with that missing finger part, it wasn't like only 98% of Gus showed up. It was still 100% Gus, right? So again, that is very different than physical things. We have unity of consciousness, oneness of our experiences, though I am made of many material parts. We're whole. We're not bundles of perceptions, identities, memories, moods, thoughts, acts, intentions. No part of the brain experiences all these perceptions in a complete unified way as I do. We have enduring self, meaning we stay unified and remain over time. So I tried to look into this just to be, maybe some of you, since this is more your field, would know this, but I tried to research this and make sure this was very good information. But I've heard this and I've seen it various places, but I haven't been able to track down where I can feel 100% confident saying it. But in a year, I've read anyway that approximately 98% of your atoms are replaced. So again, I've known Voss for about 10 years. So if he was just a physical thing, that would mean the Voss I know now is not the same Voss I knew then. Like he's a totally different person. It's like, so a good way to think about this is think of a bicycle. So let's say my dad gave me a bike and I really love that bike, but over the years I'd keep replacing parts. So first I replaced the seat, then the handlebars, then the chain, and then the tires and the wheels. And eventually after a while, like it's a whole new bike. It's totally different parts. The question would be, is that the same bike my father gave me? And in a sense, I would say, or not even a sense, I would say no. If the whole thing has been replaced with new parts, it's no longer the bike my father gave me. But we don't find that with humans. Even though we go through a lot of physical changes, we still remain the same person. There's this unity and continuation. Private access, and we kind of touched on this. We have this subjective inner private selves. Nobody else can access, can't be observed or known unless I report it, unless I tell you. Thoughts are not available to scientific observation. Physical things are publicly accessible, objective. Physical objects are observable by others. We have aboutness. We have thoughts are about things. Physical things are not about anything. Rocks aren't about anything. They just exist. I can have thoughts about physical things. I can say rocks are fun to skim on water. I can think, I hope it doesn't rain. And then we also have mental causation. Our thoughts, beliefs, and other mental states affect our actions. So wanting leads to doing. I hope to marry her. Right? If we're only physical, every thought and action would be caused by non-rational physical events determined entirely by other purely physical events. So this all goes back to what we talked about this idea of not having free will if we are strictly physical things. So just to wrap up, this is a common philosophical argument. If I'm only a physical object, like a brain or a body, then I do not have free will. But I do have free will. Therefore, I am not only a physical object. So conclusions, wrapping up, if we could just find one truth, I think we uncovered quite a few that show that our immaterial side is not the same as our physical side, and that there's a big difference between what's going on in our minds versus what's going on in our bodies and our brains. So they are not the same thing. The brain and the mind are not the same thing. And just to end with a quote from our buddy J.P. Moreland, if you begin with matter and simply rearrange it according to physical laws by means of strictly physical causes and processes, then you'll end up with increasingly different arrangements of, you guessed it, matter. Start with matter and tweak it physically, and all you will get is tweaked matter. There's no need or room for mind and consciousness to enter the picture. However, if you begin with God, then mind is the fundamental reality, not matter, and its appearance in cosmic history is not the ontological problem it is for the scientific naturalist. So if you really think about it, if the just sum up what he's saying, the physical, it starts with the physical and thinks somehow the mind emerges from that. But if ultimate reality is a mind, is God, an intelligent personal being, it would make sense that the mind is the fundamental piece of reality. So that just brings us back to our worldview questions. When we look at physicalism and dualism, are they internally coherent? Does it have explanatory power, and can it be lived? So I'll throw that back on. Let me just wrap up the two books, The Soul by J.P. Moreland and Am I Just My Brain? Two very short reads. J.P. Moreland has a much thicker version that's much more academic, but these two books were the main sources I used and were extremely helpful for me thinking out these issues and teaching them. On the right, the What is the Soul? Are Humans More Than Bodies? Those are free resources. If you go to ratiochristi.com, which is the ministry Voss and I work for, it's a college ministry, they have all sorts of great booklets, short, maybe 30 to 40 pages, usually written by some top-notch Christian scholars that are really helpful. And those two short booklets are really helpful for tackling this too. And then finally, since Voss invited me to plug my book is Reintroducing Jesus, Uncovering Jesus in the Misinformation Age. It really goes into nothing about the soul and nothing I covered here, but it basically explores all the questions I had when I was an atheist and a new Christian and then became a new Christian. And I purposely wrote it to be very accessible and very enjoyable to read. It's got a lot of goofy humor in it, a lot of goofy illustrations to get points across. It covers questions like, hasn't the New Testament been changed over time? Did they get the right books in the New Testament? What about those other gospels? What do ancient non-Christian writers tell us about Jesus? Is he just a copycat of pagan myths? Aren't the Gospels riddled with contradictions? What's the earliest information we have about Jesus? Does it hold up to history, historical scrutiny? And then it even gets into the theology. How was Jesus? How did he operate both fully as man and fully as God? Does the Trinity make sense? Did he really believe he was God? Did his apostles? And so on. So it tackles a lot of really important, tough questions, especially nowadays. If you're interacting with a lot of people who aren't Christian, a lot of those questions come up, and it's a real helpful book to answer those, and that's why I wrote it. Unfortunately, it's only available on Amazon, and I've been trying to get it converted into Kindle form, and I'm having all sorts of issues. So if anybody knows anybody who's good with that stuff, send them my way. But that's the end of the plug. So let me go back to the questions. Actually, I'll stop sharing. And if anybody has any questions or wants to talk about anything, I got, not bad. I got till 3:40 and it's 3:22.
We got one question from Patricia. She asked, where do emotions fit in with the soul, spirit, and heart?
You might have to jump in on some of these, Voss, too, because these might even be more, these are more your specialty, I think, than mine. Well, again, so she said, how does emotions fit into the soul, mind, and heart? Was that the question?
Yep.
Okay. Well, again, it all depends on how the words are being used. And again, we even see a variety in scripture. So sometimes the heart is used as the center of our emotions. So a lot of times it is used that way in scripture. So sometimes when it says heart, it is talking about your emotional life. But then, like I said, soul often is an all encompassing term to mean our whole kind of immaterial inner being, so emotions would fall into there as well. Mine tends to be more the logical side of us, the thinking side. So again, that's very general, but I think that's the best way to answer that. Again, you want to really look at the context when you're reading it. Um, but but yeah, that's how I would answer that.